First puzzle, threats in puzzle position are: queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes pawn, check. Pawn takes rook. Queen takes pawn, checkmate. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Rook takes queen. Rook takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes rook, check. Checks in this position are: rook takes rook, check. The puzzle is solved using: rook takes rook, check. Rook takes rook. Rook takes queen. Let's continue. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Here are the checks. Queen to a4, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to a4, check. Queen to d7. Queen takes bishop. Another one. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop to c3. Queen to e3. Bishop takes rook. Next puzzle, puzzle position vulnerabilities are: rook takes bishop. Checks in puzzle position are: queen to h2, check. Queen to h1, check. Queen to f2, check. Queen to e1, check. Solution to the puzzle is: rook takes bishop. Rook to c8, check. King to h7. Queen takes rook. Bishop to d4. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes queen, check. Another one. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: pawn takes pawn. Bishop takes knight, check. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. The checks are: d6, check. Bishop takes knight, check. Queen to b4, check. Queen to a3, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is: pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes bishop. Queen to b4, check. King to e8. Queen takes pawn, check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes rook, check. Pawn takes queen. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes rook, check. The answer is: queen takes rook, check. Knight takes queen. Pawn takes queen. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are: bishop takes knight. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is: pawn takes pawn. Bishop to e6. Pawn takes bishop. Next, here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are: queen takes pawn, check. Queen to g6, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. The answer is: queen takes pawn, check. King to e8. Queen takes rook, check. Another puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using: rook to c1. h6. Rook takes queen. Let's continue. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to e2. Rook to d2. Rook takes rook. Knight takes rook. Rook to e2. One more. Here are threats in puzzle position. Knight takes knight. Bishop takes pawn. Knight takes knight. Queen takes knight. Checks in puzzle position are: knight to d6, check. Queen to a4, check. The best move in puzzle position is: queen takes knight. Queen takes queen. Knight takes queen. Knight takes knight. Bishop takes knight. Another one. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. Here are the checks. Rook to e8, check. Answer to this puzzle is: rook to e8, check. King to h7. Queen to b1, check. Queen to g6. Queen takes rook. One more. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: rook takes rook. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. d7. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Queen takes rook, check. Checks in this position are: rook to e2, check. Queen to h3, check. Queen to f3, check. Queen to f2, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen to e4, check. Queen to c2, check. Answer to this puzzle is: rook to e2, check. King to g1. Bishop to c5, check. Pawn takes bishop. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook to d4. Queen takes rook, check. Let's see the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: there are no threats in this position. The checks are: Queen to h8, check. Queen to g7, check. Queen to g6, check. Queen to g5, check. Queen to f7, check. Queen to e6, check. Queen to f8, check. g5, check. The answer is: Queen to f8, check. Rook to f7. g5, check. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes rook, check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes bishop. Bishop takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Bishop takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is: f3. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes bishop. Another puzzle. The threats are: rook takes rook, check. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook takes rook, check. Solution to the puzzle is: rook takes rook, check. Bishop takes rook. Rook to b8. King to h7. Rook takes bishop. Let's continue. The threats are: pawn takes knight. Bishop takes knight. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is: bishop takes knight. Pawn takes bishop. Pawn takes knight. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to f7, check. Queen to e8, check. Queen to g7, check. Queen to g8, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Rook to e8, check. The best move in puzzle position is: bishop to c1. Bishop to g5. Rook to e8, check. Rook takes rook. Queen takes queen, check. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are: rook takes pawn, check. Pawn takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Checks in this position are: rook takes pawn, check. Knight to e2, check. Knight to d3, check. The answer is: knight to d3, check. King to d2. Knight takes rook. Next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The answer is: bishop to d5. Pawn takes bishop. Rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. Next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. The checks are: rook to c8, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to a8. b2. King to c2. Rook to h2, check. King to b1. Rook to h1, check. King takes pawn. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes bishop. Queen takes bishop. There are no checks in this position. The answer is: queen takes bishop. Queen takes queen. Pawn takes queen. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes rook. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is: bishop takes rook. Rook to e1. Rook to e6. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.